Welcome to this explainer. If you read closely through the Hebrew Bible, you might start to notice a really tantalizing mystery. Why exactly does the biblical God seem to have this absolute vendetta against tall things? Seriously, speaking as an Old Testament scholar, when you look at the text, anytime someone or something gets incredibly tall, it is literally only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down. From giant warriors to massive towers, physical elevation is never just a measurement in these ancient texts. It is a massive theological red flag. So today, we're going to completely decode the Bible's secret grammar of height.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll establish this hidden grammar. Then we'll compare the giant Goliath with the Tower of Babel. After that, we'll examine ancient ziggurats, uncover Sodom's invisible moral tower, look at the Davidic blueprint for reversal, and finally, we'll apply all of this to the modern giants we're building today. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The hidden grammar of height. Our core thesis today is that physical height is a loaded theological metaphor. It stands for human pride, self-exaltation, and the attempted autonomy from God. And there's this rhythmic three-step pattern that appears over and over again in the text, which I like to call the grammar of hubris. Okay, step 1 is human ascent. This is where someone or something rises up in pride, relying entirely on their own strength, technology, or wealth. Step 2 is divine descent. God doesn't build a bigger tower to compete, right? He simply comes down to inspect it. And then step 3, dramatic reversal. The tall fall. Basically, the higher you build yourself up apart from the divine, the harder you crash. We're going to trace this exact foundational pattern across all of our historical exhibits today.
Section 2. Goliath versus the Tower of Babel. So let's see how this grammar shifts from an individual body to a collective monument. Because both Goliath and Babel represent the exact same theological problem, just in entirely different forms. Think about Goliath. He is individual hubris. The guy is nearly 10 feet tall, covered in 125 pounds of bronze scale armor. He's essentially a walking military tank made of weaponized flesh and bronze, a living wall. Now, switch over to Babel. That is collective hubris. A unified humanity acts as a collective giant, using the absolute cutting-edge technology of their day, weaponized baked brick and bitumen, to build a monument to assault the heavens. They are both building an architecture of hubris.
Humanity builds this towering monument to reach the heavens, right? To make a great name for themselves. But then, as Genesis 11:5 reveals, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. The devastating theological irony here is just palpable. Humanity thinks they're actually threatening heaven, but from a cosmic perspective, their massive skyscraper is so puny that, metaphorically speaking, God literally has to stoop down with a magnifying glass just to see it. It perfectly captures step 2 of our grammar. Divine descent exposes the absolute illusion of human height.
Section 3. Ziggurats. Architecture of imperial hubris.
Now, let's scale up our investigation from the primeval plains of Shinar to massive geopolitical empires. Because the builders of Babel didn't just disappear, their ideological descendants went on to build empires. To really grasp this, we have to look at ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats, like the massive Itamananki in Babylon. I want you to think of these ziggurats very much like a Silicon Valley tech utopia mixed with a military fortress. The baked brick and bitumen, those weren't just building materials, they were advanced technologies of empire and permanence. These towering structures were specifically designed to enforce a narrative of absolute invincibility. They were physical manifestations of ideological propaganda, screaming to the world, "We are autonomous and we answer to no one."
And we see this perfectly illustrated in the book of Daniel. Here we have King Nebuchadnezzar's famous royal boast. He surveys his entire empire and says, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" He is the Tower of Babel evolved into an empire-scale giant. And what happens next? Yep, step 3 of our grammar, dramatic reversal. Immediately after this massive boast, he experiences a severe psychological descent. He's driven into madness, literally living like an animal in the fields, until he finally acknowledges a sovereignty higher than his own.
Section 4. Sodom's invisible moral tower. Now, the biblical authors also want to prove that you don't actually need physical bricks or a 9-foot-tall warrior to build a tower of hubris. When we look really closely at the Hebrew text, the primary words for pride, gaon and gaba, literally mean to be high or exalted. The text intentionally uses the exact same vocabulary of physical elevation that describes giants and towers, but here it's used to describe moral arrogance.
Which perfectly explains the prophet Ezekiel's quite shocking diagnosis of the city of Sodom.
He writes, "She and her daughters had pride, excessive food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." Ezekiel proves that Sodom was actually a moral ziggurat. It was an ultra-wealthy, gated community that was structurally insulated from the vulnerable people right outside its walls. Their height wasn't architectural at all. It was their social elevation, their economic abundance completely divorced from empathy. And just like Babel, the angels came down to inspect it, and the dramatic reversal was total.
Section 5. The Davidic Blueprint for Reversal. So the big question is, how do we resist this? Well, the biblical authors offer us a master blueprint. You see, the crucial point of the David and Goliath story isn't just that the plucky underdog wins. No, it's that David flat out rejects King Saul's heavy, giant-like bronze armor. He realizes you cannot defeat the giant by adopting the giant's logic. Instead, he employs a simple sling. He utilizes horizontal agility and distance rather than sheer size and vertical mass. David doesn't win by outbuilding or outsizing his opponent. He wins by categorically refusing the entire vertical logic of power. He opts instead for vulnerability and absolute covenantal dependence on God.
This typology matrix really ties our entire investigation together beautifully. Goliath represents physical height. Babel is architectural height. Babylon is imperial height, and Sodom is moral height. But the key scholarly finding is crystal clear. Every single variation of human overreach inevitably faces the exact same divine reversal. The small and faithful are lifted up, and the tall inevitably fall.
Section 6. Modern Giants and Digital Towers. Let's bring this ancient theology directly into the 21st century, because while the forms change, the spiritual dynamics remain totally identical. Today we see unchecked digital and tech overreach, where monopolistic platforms demand total autonomy from oversight. Honestly, it's remarkably similar to those imperial ziggurats. We see extreme economic wealth insulation and systemic inequality prioritizing power over empathy, and that is the exact moral height Ezekiel warned about regarding Sodom. These are the new architectures of hubris, structurally insulated and towering over the vulnerable.
And that leaves us with a pretty profound question to end on. As you look at your own generation, your own institutions, maybe even your own personal ambitions, what towers are we building today that are begging for divine descent? The biblical record shows us without a doubt that anything built on the idolatry of the large will inevitably fall. The only structures that actually last are those built on the Davidic blueprint: humility, justice, and dependence on something far greater than ourselves. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the giants.